Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Avishai, CEO and co-founder at Trend Demon, and really excited to be interviewing and speaking today with John Miller. And we'll be talking about a bunch of topics, but super excited to have John with us. So John, thanks so much for joining and making the time.
Always good to talk about this kind of stuff.
All right, awesome. So what we'll be talking about. So I wanted to kind of pick John's brain on things that he shared earlier this year in terms of transformations that are happening in the B2B ecosystem. Kind of what drawn me to this is that when you look at all those transformations, we're seeing those massive changes. So we're going to talk about that, quick intros, and really dive into those topics. So for those of you who don't know, Trend Demon, website experience optimization platform, focus on B2B and ABM scenarios, helping move target audiences throughout the buying journey. So that's us. John, how about you?
Yeah, well, so hey everyone. I guess I would describe myself as a serial marketing technology entrepreneur at this point, although that's not how I thought my career would be back when I was in college and studying physics. But I'm probably best known as the co-founder of Marketo, which is sort of a leading marketing automation platform. After Marketo, I started a company called Engagio, which was one of the players in the account-based marketing space. And in 2020, Engagio and Demandbase merged to create kind of the new Demandbase. And I spent about 3.5 years there as first the chief product officer, then the chief marketing officer. So then I left Demandbase late last year, and I have been laying the foundation for my next startup. I'm going to be in B2B marketing technology again. And I'm sort of exploring how, AI, which is such a transformational technology, can help us reimagine, some of the sort of ways that we're doing B2B marketing today. So still super early, but been, having a lot of fun back at the startup phase.
Amazing. I think that, as I guess one of the first people that have identified this transformation into ABM some years ago, I think that would make you a great person to speak with about those transformations and how we're looking at the next era of changes that's going to be happening. And I wanted to talk a little bit about 5 of these transformations, if you could kind of talk about them and first of all understand what has changed, kind of the before and after, and kind of put them both in front of each other, and then talk through about those transformations, what they mean for us as marketers, what they mean about go-to-market motions, opportunities and challenges, I guess, in that same respect. And most of it is just 2 ways to look at the same transformation from different lenses.
Sure.
So I'll start with kind of the first topic. So we talked about 5 topics in terms of, if I go back just to the main roles, we want to talk about the role of brand and brand in B2B, and then talking about ABM to BGM to buying group marketing, talking a bit more about how the measurement perspective, how those shifts are also affecting how what we measure affects what we do essentially, and how those things are kind of going back into methodologies and practices. First party, and we'll of course leave some time for AI, because I don't think we can have a discussion today without talking about AI, and especially kind of trying to figure out what is really hype versus what really is a foundational longer term change that we're seeing and the potential there.
Yep. I think stay on the prior slide for a sec. I think before we get in, go to the 8 predictions. I think before we kind of get into these 5 things, I mean, I think just a minute of background context, sort of between why I'm talking about all these different things. And that's the fact that I would say that the for the last 15 years, since the early days of Marketo, I've been preaching, and a lot of marketers have been using, I think, a B2B marketing playbook. That sort of I think we've all come to know and use. It's start with things like content and webinars to kind of capture early stage leads. Know that they're not all ready, so you're going to nurture some and score them and pass the right ones to sales at the right time, like a baton. And then sales will then take it and run with it and close it. And everything tries to be highly measurable. Every dollar is connected to a lead, is connected to a deal. You're using attribution to kind of prove what works. And that's kind of been the way marketers have been running the last 15 years. On top of that, there's the sort of predictable revenue SDR playbook, where you sort of hire SDRs and they do outbound, and the whole thing, we're measuring the whole thing with the serious decisions framework of things like MQLs to SQLs. That's the playbook that we've been using.
Right.
And yet I go talk to CMOs and heads of demand, and what I'm consistently hearing is that it's hard out there. this is really, I'm really talking about the number 3 prediction on the slide here. So often, I mean, the conversation with CMOs is, yeah, my pipeline targets have gone up 30% next year, but I have the same budget. Right. Which would be bad by itself, but I didn't even make my pipeline targets last year with that budget. So how am I magically going to somehow do 30% better this year? And I think that's what a lot of people are really struggling with. Like, it's just not working, and I don't think it's because the marketers are bad. I think it's because the playbook doesn't work anymore. Right. And there's lots of factors that go into why the playbook isn't working. Things like buyers have just kind of gotten indifferent to the tactics we're using. 15 years ago, people would actually fill out a form and download an ebook. Now they know if they do that, they're going to start getting unwanted emails and phone calls. So they found ways to kind of be anonymous, and so on and so on. So, I mean, buyer indifference is a big one, but I think another one of the key problems with the playbook, has been that we've over-rotated on to highly measurable demand gen and have underinvested in brand, which I think is just a good lead up into the first point you wanted to make.
Yeah, and I think just touching that before we kind of dive into the brand. So what you're basically saying, we're obsessed about building those machines, right? Those revenue machines. We love to see that process work. We had that process. That machine is broken. We understand that machine, as we knew it, is no longer functioning, right? It's not producing that predictable revenue. So we need to think about a new machine. But if I go and I look back at the past 3 years and this huge roller coaster, and just kind of zooming out in macro a bit, apart from just what marketers or GTM leaders have been doing, I remember back in 2020, 21, everything we did worked, right? You could have said the playbook works perfectly, right? Because everything you did, everything you stuck, everybody was buying, everything was booming. But is it possible that the playbook was broken even back then? We just didn't see it. Now, when the bust comes and we get the headwinds, and if you're not on the top of your game, that's kind of when we see, the water subsides and you see who's wearing a bathing suit. Because right now, you can't just do whatever you did in 21 and do things and everything stuck. So is that the case in your opinion, that we're now confronted with something that happened a few years ago? It's just now kind of hitting us in the face.
I think that's a good way to describe it. It isn't that the economy has made the playbook not work. I think you're right. It is the economy not being strong has exposed the playbook not working.
Right. So I think in some ways, some of these changes aren't innovations, but they're kind of going back to basics in certain respects, right? If we're talking about brand, right? That's something that we've, I think, neglected. Maybe we were able to neglect it when things were booming, but this is, I think, goes back to doing proper marketing. But tell me what you think about this kind of reshift, and now why is everybody, and we hear that a lot. I think it's now becoming more and more known for marketers to talk about brand, where in the past it was like, no, we're doing demand gen, pure play, ROI, give me the CAC, give me the LTVs, and everything that's fluff we're pushing aside. So how do you see this transition?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of the problem is that the focus on demand tends to limit our marketing to primarily the people who are looking to buy right now. Like back in the old days, you could market to the people who weren't yet interested by offering things like ebooks and thought leadership that they could download. And that was still kind of doing demand to the people not yet in market. But now they don't want to do that anymore. And so a lot of the demand function is everybody fighting over, the same people who are looking to buy right now. And then, there's a study that came out from the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, which has become almost like apocryphal in B2B, which found that only 5% of the buyers are in market to buy at any given point in time, which means, 95% of your target market isn't looking to buy right now. But with the traditional playbook, it's so focused on highly measurable tactics that drive pipeline right now, that leads us to underinvest in the brand. I mean, it leads us to everyone fighting over those same 5%. And I think what's happening is we're all feeling the impact of that weaker brand, these days. Like when your brand is strong, it makes the rest of your marketing perform better. Your demand gen programs perform better. Your retention is better, when the brand is strong. The chart that you're showing with data from Benchmarker compared companies that made their bookings number last year with companies that didn't make their bookings number last year. And interestingly, the companies that made their number spent more on brand than demand. The companies that didn't make their number spent more on demand versus brand. So I think it does start to show that, we need to rebalance how we think about some of these investments. That said, go ahead.
No, so this just really resonates with a previous conversation I had with Adam Kaiser, talking about the fact that when potential buyer reaches out, 80% of the time, 84% of their journey is already complete. So those 5% that do engage do so at such a later stage, and from their prerogative, right? They're calling the shots, they're leading this. So your ability to influence them at that 5% moment, if you haven't done everything leading up to it, is very, very limited. Maybe that's even lost when they're in the market to buy, right? And that was the whole premise of ABM, right? We will tell you who is in the market, but if you haven't done all the heavy lifting, that's not going to help you to reach out, even if you are maybe a potential contender, right?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. And so I think, a lot of times people get wrapped up around brand, though, thinking like, well, that just means I got to spend a lot of money and do like a big ad campaign and billboards and, so on and such forth. So that's where I just always try to remind marketers that, brand is really, in many ways, it comes down to the core of just getting your positioning right. More than anything else, are you really, really clear on what you want people to think and feel about you when you're not in the room? It's usually just a couple of words. That's all you get. BMW, performance; Volvo, safety; Apple, design; Disney, magic. Can you come up with that one or very few words that is what your brand stands for? And I bet most CMOs can't. And yet that's what the brand is all about. And then from there, what is your story? This is Simon Sinek's why. Usually this comes from almost at the CEO level. But like, how do you, as a CMO, how do you articulate why your company exists? Like, what is the galvanizing story behind what's happening in the marketplace that creates a need that you can kind of solve? If you can get those things right, then it's not that hard to create messaging and then start using that language to kind of tell your story. Frankly, that's more important than what your logo looks like or your colors or all that kind of stuff. I think CMOs change that stuff all the time, right? But in some ways that's focusing on, I think, the last piece of the puzzle and not the first piece of the puzzle.
Right, and when we're talking about, I think there's a notion in B2B that everything, right, is measured, everything can be quantified, and yet specifically with brand, there's going to be those investments where you're not going to be able to tie them to ROI. And I think part of that maturity is having that discussion with a CFO that says, look, we're going to invest in this because we need to. There's going to be those outcomes. We're not going to be able to tie them. How do you recommend, marketing leaders or GTM leaders have this discussion with a CEO maybe that doesn't get brand, right? I've heard people that say if they don't get leave the company. But let's say that's not an option. How would you explain or demonstrate that the impact of those investments?
Well, first off, it's not easy, and I don't want to kind of underestimate it. The old playbook, the Marketo playbook, was nice because it was like intellectual, like the math worked. Spend X, get this many leads, turns into this many opportunities, turns into this many deals. And the math was nice. It just didn't reflect reality. And so now we're sort of realizing, okay, reality is much more complicated than that. So it does start by recognizing that we have to change how we think about measuring these brand investments. Especially ads. Like, too many people try to put a call to action on their ad. Click here, download this, sign up for this. And that's sort of almost the exact wrong thing. I'd argue if your ad has a call to action, you're doing it wrong. Oftentimes I like to say, we can't think of marketing as a gumball machine, right? This is not something where you can just put money in and something comes out kind of the other side. So it's going to take time for CMOs to figure out, how do you talk about this stuff in a boardroom without seeming like the arts and crafts squishy, person. I think that the CMOs who can do this most effectively, right, will be the CMOs that are the most successful. It's going to come down to interpersonal relationships. It's going to come down to, building the credibility and trust. So that way, you can say, look, go to them and say, look, marketing isn't the same as it was 10 years ago. The world's changed. Like, the world's more buying is more complicated than it was, right? So given that, let's co-create, how should we measure this thing, right? If you can have that conversation with your CFO, you're going to be in a much better position than just kind of walking in and saying, oh, we're going to invest in some brand, right? That's just, will never come across as credibility building.
Yeah, I think that, because we've been doing this for enough years, that we've seen that transition from sales and marketing being the drivers of the deal. We, remember sales-led motions where the sales rep had information, the AE had all the information, the power is shifting to the buyer. And in that sense, you're not pushing the buyer, you need to lay the road. So going back to your point of the calls to action, right? You want to be the one laying foundations for the buyers to move on rather than ones trying to push them or force them into different areas. But you have to give them that road, and you have to remove obstacles from that road. So a lot of the things that also we see and we talk about with customers is this role of removing friction. And to your points, is also probably adding the awareness of when you get that mental image of when I say your company, I understand where to place you. I have kind of a mental map that I understand your values, but I also understand where when I'm supposed to fit, to fit your solution or your value proposition. So, and this may be a good time to talk a little bit about this movement that we're starting to see from ABM. And it's funny because still not everybody is doing it, as some are still onboarding ABM, but there's already this movement into this deeper resolution, right, of buying group. And you also mentioned that in terms of that prediction that we're going to increase resolution, or we're going to need to increase that resolution. So maybe tell us a little bit, how do you see this transition? How do you describe it, what it is, and how can marketers prepare for it, or adapt or readapt for this kind of change?
Yeah, I sort of like to use a Goldilocks analogy. We started with leads, right? And then what we found out was that leads were too narrow because, just one person showing up on our website, didn't really give us indications about what's happening at the company. And yet, if we had 10 people from the company all show up on our website, but none of them downloaded anything, right? None of them would become leads. And yet there's clearly something happening at the company. Right. So we all started doing ABM because we realized leads don't buy things, company buy things, and leads were too narrow. But then, now that we've been doing ABM for, 8-9 years, we're starting to learn that accounts are too broad. There are a whole bunch of personas at a company that might never be part of our buying committee, right? So just marketing to the whole account is too broad. But the biggest problem with ABM is that it, especially if you're a company that sells more than one product, you're going to actually be at a different stage of a relationship with that company for each of your different products, right? You could have product number one and they've bought it, so they are a customer for product one, which means in an ABM system that account is a customer, right? But what about product number two, right?
Which there's a separate group of people.
There's a different group of people, or maybe it's the same people. It almost it matters or doesn't matter. But the point is, for product number two, they're not even necessarily in market for that solution. And for product number three, they are in market and you have to identify that. And product number four, you have an open opportunity. And so treating the account monolithically, you miss out on all of this richness of what's going on. It's related to one of the other trends or flaws with the old traditional playbook. The old traditional playbook is heavily biased towards new business acquisition. But in today's market, today's economy, we're all rightly much more focused on net revenue retention, retaining and expanding our customers. And the buying groups are especially important for that expansion because it helps us to identify those opportunities to sell product 2, product 3, product 4 within an existing account. So in a perfect world, the center of our marketing in B2B isn't the account, those are too narrow. Isn't the lead, those are too narrow. It isn't the account, those are too broad. It's the buying group, which is just right.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of what marketers could do, is buying group, or focusing on the buying group, is it only for multi-product vendors, or is it also for more accurately assessing, right, the probability of the deal, to more accurately assess intent, essentially, right?
I mean, buying groups are important if you have multiple products, or if you can sell the same product to multiple groups in a company. An example of that was like Zendesk. You could sell Zendesk to the support team or the IT desk. But if you have one product that can only sell to one group, you can probably get away without buying groups. But if you have any complexity beyond that, I think that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. All right. And that takes me kind of to another shift that I think is one of the problems of B2B inheriting. I always look at B2B sometimes as a younger brother inheriting stuff from B2C. And sometimes you get stuck with clothes that aren't the right fit for you, or approaches. And when we're talking about, you mentioned lead-based, right? That's where we started. Or even analytics, which looks at an individual person converting on something on a page or on a website, which is the classic B2C holy grail to get them to buy or to do something. So we got those tools and approaches right from lead-based, and we're looking at account-based measurement and following what you just said, also an increased resolution on if we can map the buying group's engagement rather than just the account. So we're seeing that transformation in those approaches. Is this something that you see is going to continue to become more important? How are you seeing this in terms of measurement and also measuring success and reflecting success? If we're going back to our discussion and ways to show ROI and the challenges there, are you seeing that as well in the transformations?
Yeah, I think this almost connects the first two things we've talked about, right? Because the demand model was very focused on generating leads, and as I sort of alluded to a couple of times, that is just there's so many problems with that, right? It's the fact that leads don't buy, companies buy. The fact that the sort of lead model tries to attribute then the source of that lead to the source of the deal, which loses out on really the richness of kind of all things that are ultimately happening and influencing a deal. And ultimately, the lead MQL model biases us towards the demand gen and kind of underinvest in the brand, as we've sort of talked about. So, as the slide says, I think starting to think about account and buying group journeys does matter more. So at a minimum, knowing for your target market and your tier 1 accounts and your tier 2 accounts, who's completely cold, who's actually showing some engagement, who's actually moving to in-market, who did you actually get an opportunity with? Just being able to understand how those different buying groups or accounts move through the stages starts to be, I think, one of the key pieces of kind of how we're going to measure the new playbook. I said a word in there that I think is important, the word engagement. Obviously, I'm a fan of engagement. I named my last company after it, Engagio. And again, engagement can be a fluffy concept. We tried to make engagement more rigorous by tying it to time. Like generally speaking, all things being equal, if you have 2 accounts and one is spending time with you, right? They actually come to your website, they actually open and respond to your emails, they attend your events. That's clearly better than an account that doesn't do that. Before a company spends money with you, they spend time with you. So we tried to make measuring time, therefore measuring engagement, more of kind of a first-class metric. And you can measure things like lift. If you have a group of accounts, how much engagement did you have with them before you started your campaign? How much did you get after you did the campaign? Or maybe you do a test and control group. What was the increased engagement for accounts that saw the campaign versus the ones that were in the control? This starts to become a much more rigorous way to measure things that don't involve that kind of click here, download this button, directly attribute some connection, which is good. The problem we're still going to have as CMOs, as we talked about a minute ago, is engagement is still not a boardroom level concept, right? The CFO still doesn't know how to connect engagement to revenue. Right. And that's, again, the journey that we're all on. How do we, start to show how engagement does matter? How, and things like the test and control groups and all that, I think are part of the answer. And part of it is just explaining the changing nature of buying. But ultimately, I think the new metrics involve account and buying group journeys and engagement, lift. Those are some of the kind of the key things I think we're going to see.
So until now, we talked about those 3 transformations within kind of B2B marketing and go-to-market. Now we're going to talk a little bit about transformations that are happening outside and that can affect. The first transformation is actually regulatory, or something that is happening across the ecosystem, is deprecation of third-party, increase of awareness to privacy and consent. And so this is a change that is like forced right upon the industry and forces it to react. But I think it connects, and the reason that I wanted to bring it up, I think it connects to those previous points of measuring or being able to connect with individuals with a buying group on a very direct level, rather than counting or relying on either networks or third-party data. So I'm curious to understand how you're seeing this. How dramatic do you think this changes, and what do you think are the implications for marketers in the next few years?
Yeah, I guess I kind of want to answer this in 2 different ways. The first is, I think kind of the concept of owning your audience is bigger than just the connection to first-party data. I think, content marketing has changed. People don't want to download the ebook anymore and give you a form or a form fill, so we need to move away from individually gated pieces of content. Instead, I like how Anthony Kanata and Audience Plus talk about building audiences, and thinking almost more like the New York Times, where, here's my free content. That is, I put it out there because, that's how I'm building my brand and that's how I'm building my awareness. But then if you like the content well enough and you have enough affinity, you can become a member, and, effectively subscribe to my premium content. And that can be premium experiences. It can be merch, which is different from swag. It can be premium content in addition to kind of like physical and kind of virtual experiences. And so effectively, the subscription is the new opt-in.
Right. And the audience is driving it, right? So just like buyers are driving their journeys, the audience is choosing, right? Choosing also in terms of timing, right? On demand versus I have to show up to something. So everything, all the power is gravitating towards the person, their information, their, personal information, their decisions.
But I start with that because, for new business acquisition, it's really, how else can you get both permission and effectively the cookie that's going to let you track the behavior you need, without the form fill. So this is, I think, important for the new business acquisition side. Mm-hmm. The flip side is for your customers. And we talked about just a minute ago the importance of NRR and expansion. You actually have a lot of data about them, because they're using your product, they're interacting with you. You still, for new buying groups where you don't have relationships, you still need sort of the audience approach. But now this is where it comes down to the data side of things. We ultimately want to be in a world where we have a good infrastructure for tracking all this kind of data, because that's how we're going to get the signals that are going to tell us, where are people in the buying cycle, how should we be interacting with them, and dealing with them. And then the final point I'll make here is, and then the backdrop of what's going on with all this stuff is the demise of third-party cookies. Mm-hmm. And that's going to have, I think, a relatively profound impact on certain sources of third-party data. Obviously, the vendors like Demandbase have very well thought through responses of how they're responding. But regardless, it's change coming to the third-party data landscape.
Okay, and I know we just have a couple of minutes, so I wanted to ask you about AI. What are you excited about? You mentioned things that you're dealing with and you're thinking through. So what are the opportunities? What are you thinking through about it? And how to maybe help marketers differentiate between really fluff, hype, and FOMO versus maybe longer term approaches to AI, LLM, again, breaking it down to the different components of it.
Yeah, so I think a year ago when ChatGPT was first kind of coming out, we were all pretty amazed by what it could do, because it was revolutionary. We hadn't ever seen anything like it. I think in the last year, we've all sort of learned that, LLMs like ChatGPT are basically trained on everything in the internet. So not only does it bring all the biases of the internet and whatnot, it also is eminently average. It is almost by definition average.
Yeah, statistically average, definitely.
So that has a place. I use ChatGPT all the time. Help me brainstorm something. Which are the best towns to visit on the Amalfi Coast? You name it. I have it draft legal language for contracts I don't want to bother sending to my lawyer. So there's lots of places where I think it can be very, very valuable. But for marketers, we need to recognize that the content it's going to create for us, has its limitations. So that's where I sort of talk about the short-term hype. I think we are all starting to backlash against kind of just the AI created content. I can tell when somebody's LinkedIn post was written by ChatGPT. I even put up my own post on LinkedIn about here's all the pet peeves I hate about it when I see people write that way. So I do think we're going to see a backlash in the near term. Similarly, there's a lot of AI powered SDR prospecting tools right now that basically scrape your LinkedIn and then take a generic email and slightly personalize it and send it. And I think we're going to see some backlash against that too. So, put another way, where, I think AI is interesting, but it's not transformational, is when we're just using it to streamline an existing process. Like draft my email for me. Mm-hmm. Okay, fine. As long as you're still having a human that then spends time on it to make it better, it can be a useful tool. But what I've sort of been trying to think about is, what happens when we can build an AI that starts to just really understand marketing and can understand our data, and now can you start to do things where, as a marketer, instead of logging into your marketing automation system and dragging a list, like give me all the VPs at tier 1 accounts, in San Francisco, you can just go to and say, hey, I want to do a dinner, an executive dinner. Who should I invite? That's not having ChatGPT come up with an average set of words for you, but that's an incredibly compelling vision for marketers where we can start just talking about what we want, and then the system helps us do it. So that's where I'm excited about the long-term potential, and has some clues about kind of what I've been thinking about for my next business.
And so forth. I know we're out of time, and you have to hop off, but I really wanted to thank you.
No, thanks for having me. I love talking about this stuff, and look forward to answering any questions online. People can find me if they want to follow up.
Amazing. Thanks, John. It was a pleasure.